Jimmy Carter once said that human rights is the soul of our foreign policy because human rights is the very soul of our sense of nationhood. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Elise Tong, and this is my partner, Addison Raff. We, the affirmative, agree that Articles 2, 12, and 35 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should be edited. We support the changes to Articles 2, 12, and 35 with the following three contentions. Number one, the changes will better protect the security of ourselves and our posterity. Number two, discrimination will be further prevented. And number three, rulings and requirements instated by the American Medical Association and the Council of Europe would be further enforced. Let me elaborate on our first contention. The changes to the articles will better protect the security of ourselves and our posterity. According to the Golden State Killer case, genetic profiling of an individual can occur even without their DNA. Inverse Magazine states that, quote, if one of your relatives were to spit into a vial for sequencing, they are giving up a bit of your own genetic information along with theirs without your consent, end quote. If a member of your family has given up his or her DNA to a DNA testing kit, your personal information will also be openly available. Mr. Kearns says that your information and identity can be plastered on databases for their contents to be mined and hauled by big data analytics. According to yourgenome.org, there are more than 60 countries operating genetic databases, increasing the vulnerability of databases to abuse and hacking. Our second contention is that the changes will lead to a minimization of discrimination. There have been many cases in the past when DNA testing has led to genetic discrimination. According to Mr. Andrews, during the early 1970s, several African Americans who were known to be carriers for the mutation associated with sickle cell anemia were denied insurance coverage or charged higher premiums. There is also a movement in the United States that claimed that complex social traits such as alcoholism, criminality, and depression were inherited. According to Karen Norgard, PhD, genetics were cited as justification for policies that restricted immigration into the US, as well as for state laws that permitted involuntary sterilization of criminals, mentally disabled individuals, and even unwed mothers. Our third contention is that access to our DNA provides companies with monetary gains without the individual seeing a single penny of it. As seen in the Henrietta Lacks case, scientists can take biopsies from patients and culture them for research even when the family has not consented to the prolonged usage of the cells. Companies were and still are mass-producing Ms. Lax's cells and distributing the cells across the globe for a huge profit without the Laxes seeing a single cent. It is true that in the late 1990s, the Council of Europe created a treaty to protect against the misuse of biological and medical advances, and the AMA requires physicians to disclose applications of the commercial use of samples of human tissue to the patient. The AMA also suggests that physicians should share profits with the patients, but these requirements are not enforced by law. The changes to Articles 2, 12, and 35 would enforce those rulings and requirements. All in all, we, the affirmative, support the changes to Articles 2, 12, and 35. With the contention stated earlier, your privacy and the privacy of the generations to come will be better protected. As Mr. William Bennett once said, quote, America's support for human rights and democracy is our noblest export to the world, end quote. With the alterations to the Declaration of Human Rights, discrimination will be drastically minimized, and we will finally have the right to our own DNA. Thank you.
All right. So your argument suggests a change which will affect populations at a global standpoint. Why do you think a single proposal for this change will create a worldwide demand for it? So do you think all countries will agree to this?
Well, we can't assure that all the countries will agree to this, but we can be sure that America can make these changes to protect you and all of your children to come.
All right. And considering the time, paperwork, and backlash that changing the Universal Declaration of Rights would create, do you think that the projected efficiency of the individual right to own DNA will benefit lives drastically enough to make up for a mess like this?
It definitely would, because your personal information will no longer be able to be stolen by other people, and you can better protect yourself.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, so every individual is responsible for keeping parts of their personal data safe, but as time progresses, the demand for freedom is increased and requests for the security and ownership of individual identity are being considered. Where should the line be drawn? The situation at hand introduces the proposal to grant people the right to individual ownership of their genetic data, meaning DNA. The affirmative proposes to modify the items of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there's much to say about the fact that people should not be given the right to own their own DNA. Any government is reasonable to be involved in question of DNA and how it is used by citizens. As of now, DNA databases have proven to be beneficial to many global governments and citizens, like DNA profiling in criminal investigations and DNA analysis for medical advancements. Also, by prohibiting the ways that genetic information about oneself is revealed, the probability for this sensitive information to be misused by businesses who use it for commercial purposes and individuals who use it for the wrong intentions is decreased. There should be no plan to incorporate an individual right's DNA, since the breakthrough of possibilities of using genetic data are recent and present. Instead, the right to personal DNA should be delayed until more will be declared about the safety on sharing DNA and medical information to individuals.
I heard you say that the right to your DNA, well, having a DNA database would actually help in criminal investigations. But have you thought of how many of people in criminal investigations have actually been wrongly accused of the crimes?
Sure, the database is new and there is a lot of faults that it comes with, but so far there is around 11 million suspects and criminals in the United States database. And with all of those DNA samples, there have been a lot of cases that have been solved using DNA. So we
Yes, but
believe that there is there's more benefit to using DNA in criminal investigations.
Yes, but do you realize that in those 11 million cases, there are still cases where it says that it's been solved, but it's actually been incorrectly solved, and the wrong suspect has been accused of the crime.
Sure, in those cases, but if we take what you guys are proposing with using, not using DNA in those cases, there's also going to be a lot of faults with that, and we're still unsure of how those cases could go. So far, with the margin of error as it is, we believe that we should still keep on using this method because there's a chance that introducing new methods so early on, there would be a lot more negative outcomes with it.
And though there are some cases in which not everything is correct, it is currently one of the most important ways to solve certain criminal investigations. So if we were to get rid of it, I mean, even though there are some cases that it's not as beneficiary, most of the time it's one of the most important parts in investigations.
All right, so we'll go with our next. The biggest limitation to giving individuals ownership of their own DNA as its purpose as data that is necessary for government use. Creating restrictions for how much access a country's government has to people's DNA will create a loss of efficiency and would be putting life-saving science at risk. The new system would require the consent of people to provide samples of their DNA to researchers, and only if willing to provide their DNA would have to follow up with adequate measures that would not be challenging their right. A big portion of what global governments use with genomic data is DNA profiling, the process of determining an individual's DNA characteristics in the situation of criminal investigations. DNA samples found at the scene of the crime, like fingerprints, blood, saliva, tissue, sweat, hair, and more, are matched to available DNA records in a government database. According to the 2008 Interpol Global DNA Profiling Survey, there are already 120 countries that use DNA profiling and 55 more countries that have their own DNA databases. The practice was only recently introduced but is currently used to solve many investigations like serial murders and rape cases. And according to the DNA Diagnostic Center, there are already 11 million suspects and criminals in the United States database, like I mentioned before. In a case from 2018, the Golden State Killer was convicted on charges of murder and rape between 1974 and 1986 after a new method of using DNA evidence linked his genetic data to that found at the crime scene, according to the Washington Post. Obviously, the situation always works in the same manner when those convicted for crimes are proven to be innocent through new DNA findings. But when people have ownership over their DNA, the whole database would be erased. There would be a lot more harm caused when this database is not available, and no government would have the ability to test DNA and protect the community from potential threats. In medical research, DNA analysis is used to counter disease and human issues. According to the National Center for Biotechnology Information, it is used in the diagnosis of hereditary diseases, investigations of malignant processes, in forensic medicine, and for the detection of infectious pathogens. For example, after DNA analysis was introduced and there was much genetic data available for professionals to use, the diagnosis of cystic fibrosis, a serious hereditary disease, was improved. So what happens when the science that is funded by the government loses its access to the research that it has produced? Using DNA records in the government has greatly improved the development of the community, whether it be for safety purposes or technological advancement. Changing the system to protect just one right of the people instead of protecting the greater amount of people would not be a wise decision.
So just to clarify, you believe that the benefits of using DNA in science outweigh the risks of them being used against people against their will?
Could you repeat that?
So just to clarify, you believe that using DNA in like scientific and criminal investigations outweighs the risks of them being used against innocent people who happen to be related to the victim?
Well, it plays into the situation that it's for the greater good. So we believe that even though there is a lot of risks and there is a lot of different ways that using this data could be interpreted, we believe that for the bigger community, it's more important to protect it from things like those involved in criminal investigations.
Did you realize that if you have a national database of DNA, it could lead to an increase in identity theft?
Well, sure. With the government, there is a lot of ways that people could hack into the government. But if you think about it, if people now have a right to their own DNA and it's in their access, there's a lot of easier ways that hackers could take that information from you because now it's with you instead of under the protection of the government.
Well, it would be the same with the government because with the government, there's the added incentive of handing off your information to other third parties.
Well, with the government, so since the government has access to DNA right now, you don't really know of how the government is using your DNA to sell it to third-party companies. But when it's with you as an individual, it is your responsibility to keep your DNA safe. And when it is sent to third-party companies, and then it's your responsibility at that point.
Well, it's not necessarily your responsibility though, because there are also lots of hackers that can steal your information.
It's your responsibility to keep it in mind and keep it safe and protected because
that is also going to be a risk no matter what circumstance there is. Like there's always going to be that margin of like where things could go wrong. So yeah.
Quote, "We now have the power to quickly and easily alter DNA. It could eliminate disease. It could solve world hunger. It could provide unlimited clean energy. It could really get out of hand," end quote, from Amy Maxman. This is the case with the negatives argument. The problem is that unless strict limits are placed on how and why DNA can be used, governments and private companies will likely take advantage of an individual's information. In fact, companies like 23andMe are using some Miranda rights-esque wordings in their terms of service, with lines such as, quote, "Genetic information you share with others could be used against your interests," end quote. Results are not always kept anonymous either. When signing up for websites such as 23andMe, they often ask whether you mind if your data is used for scientific research. If you answer that you don't mind, this research can be published, albeit supposedly anonymously, to an online public database used by medical professionals and/or related researchers. Now keep in mind that the name will not be shared, so technically the company has kept its promise of confidentiality. Some people also upload their results on their own, sometimes including names and an age estimate as well. Experiments have proven that, even though a piece of DNA has no other identifying information on it, you can, with a little research, find exactly whose DNA it is. You can look up results that are similar to the DNA, which will turn up some profiles with names attached. These are probably distant or not so distant familial relations. With this information, it's not hard to look through public records and see who the anonymous DNA donor was. You can find out gender by looking at the provided DNA, and if you have even a rough idea of how old the person is, your job will become much easier. In fact, according to Wired, quote, more than 60% of Americans with European ancestry can be identified through their DNA using open genetic genealogy databases, regardless of whether they've ever sent in a spit kit, end quote. Some insurance companies even ask for genetic data, claiming that such information will help lower your insurance rates. There are also employee wellness programs that go through your genetic information to find whether you are especially susceptible to certain diseases. For example, the company Gena Medical offers programs that are supposed to evaluate your employees' health risks according to their DNA. Although the website uses such optimistic and encouraging phrases as, quote, genetic education and wellness assessment, end quote, and listing the benefits to the employees' health, they also list how much money employers spend on cancer treatment and cardiology disease treatment, $207 billion and $264 billion, respectively. These figures and their inclusion as significant data heavily imply that the usage of this technology will identify employees whose health may present fiscal problems to the company, thereby placing bias against these people in the minds of their employers. Even if companies have the best interest of clients in mind, the simple truth is that the sheer power contained in genetic information could, and in all probability will, be used against them at some point if non-beneficial sequences or traits are found. It is undeniable that if a company can save money, it will do everything in its power to save money, and this offers companies quite the deal. As for Gena Medical's promises of security and privacy, these things are simply inherently problematic. If mega corporations like Target can have their databases hacked and leak your personal credit card and banking information, then is it not also likely that the same can be done to companies who will also carry your monetary information, carry vital personal information that has to do with your very biological makeup? Imagine the repercussions if an event like that were to play out. Keeping the general population informed about the integrity, location, and usage of their medical information is vital to public peace of mind and is unarguably a human right. By including the amendments to the Declaration, we protect the employee, the patient, the consumer, the citizen, and the overall human being.
Okay, so you're seemingly proposing that the government access be completely cut off from genomic databases. Therefore, in circumstances such as criminal investigations, if the defensive party does not opt to provide their DNA because that's going to be their choice, do you think that the justice system could make up for potentially the most important incriminating lost evidence in multiple criminal investigations?
Although genetic information has proved valuable in some cases, there have been a lot of cases where it hasn't been, and a lot of attention has actually been drawn recently to a New York lab where it was being very inaccurate, and all of the technicians were saying that a lot of the simulations run and the results gains were not as accurate as a lot of people thought. So I don't think that there would be that much of a drawback. If anything, it would make it more reliable to the people, and I think it would be more accurate without DNA testing in a lot of cases.
Okay.
All right, let's carry on then. Okay, I go this time, correct? Just making sure.
Negative.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that, giving people the right of ownership of DNA comes with other problems. According to an article by Gizmodo, quote, it wasn't until 2014 that the United States granted individuals a right of access to their own laboratory test results, including genomic data, end quote. It may seem obvious that people should have a right to look at their medical data, but considering how confusing DNA test results are, they reveal genetic variants that are arguable, poorly understood, and in some cases wrong. Already, the decision is seen as troublesome by health professionals because without the right tools to interpret the results, people could be making misinformed choices about their health. What will happen when the people have a right of ownership of their DNA? Companies based on consumers' genomic data that exist today, like Ancestry and 23andMe, have growing databases of DNA samples. The companies create reports based on genetic information of DNA and are able to access them at any time. But when consumers have all of the ownership of their DNA, it's not just a sample of themselves that they are giving to these companies. They would be giving another piece of private information that only they had access to. Here come other problems like hacking and third-party organizations profiting from the genetic data for their own uses. According to CNBC, quote, more than 80% of 23andMe customers agree to let the company share their DNA with research partners, end quote. But how many of them know what their information is being used for? Already, there are companies, quote, being investigated by the Federal Trade Commission over their policies for handling personal info and genetic data and how they share that info with third parties. End quote. The methods that are currently available that would allow an individual to have ownership of their DNA have been concurred with more faults than benefits to patients.
As the negative has previously stated, the demand for freedom has increased in the midst of an increased identity theft and oppression. We need to expand Articles 212 and 35 to better protect ourselves and our posterity from thieving firms and governments that want to steal our identities for money. The negative has repeatedly mentioned that this expansion should be postponed, but we agree that the time is now. Safety and security are things that should never be postponed. We need this resolution to protect individuals and their families. Information contained in DNA is limitless. According to yourgenome.org, information about hair color, eye color, genetic diseases, and more can all be found in your DNA. And once it is out in the internet, anybody can access that information. This sorely needed security can no longer be delayed. The negative has said that the government should have all the right to your own DNA because it will be safer for you. We, the affirmative, disagree. In fact, your genetic information would be much safer as your own right. When the government has had a whole database of genetic information, there will be nothing to stop them from selling your information to commercial institutions. The negative says that DNA would help for police investigations, but searching through such a large database of information leads to a false DNA match and leads to many innocent people's arrests. In fact, according to yourgenome.org, as many as 1 in every 100 forensic tests performed on the DNA of suspected criminals may give a false result. The negative said that this resolution should not be taken, but it certainly should. You have a right to your own DNA, and with the resolution, no firm will ever be able to get your genetic identity without your consent again. Thank you.
So the affirmative to giving people their right to own their DNA could argue that individuals should own their DNA because it is immoral to deny one ownership of information about their own health and body. But realistically, DNA is a product of nature that cannot be patented because there is nothing to be replicated. The idea of DNA cannot be stolen, but an individual's important medical data can. The affirmative opposes to these claims that the public would be hurt by how government continues to store people's genetic information, but it is more likely that the establishment of a right to ownership of DNA will harm society as a whole, as now there is a risk of theft of personal information and restrictions on how the government could be using DNA to help with criminal investigations and solving disease and human issues. The situation at hand is not an argument about people's right to view their DNA data, but the right to be the only individual that can view that data. Given the current knowledge that we have on sharing genetic information, it is not sensible to get a universal plan to establish a right for possession of personal DNA. Individuals should always stay cautious about what information about themselves is released to others, and if owning DNA becomes a right universally, that becomes threatened. Genetic information that is under the jurisdiction of patients lacks regulations for the protection of DNA from third parties. Therefore, people should be conscious about how they would not benefit from establishment of a right to individually own their DNA because there is much more supporting the current system and much contradicting a new system.
As Nelson Mandela once said, quote, "To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity." The right to own your own DNA should be and is a basic human right. Article 35 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights needs to be expanded to give the individual right to own DNA and explanation of medical information. We as human beings have the rights to adequate standard of living, regardless of DNA complications, predisposition to genetic diseases, and more. In other words, Article 12 should be expanded to include the right to our own biological information, and Article 2 needs to be expanded to add genetic information to the list of things that should not be used to discriminate. These changes to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, once used correctly alongside the current rights to DNA, will help level the playing field of society. Another thing that the negative has mentioned is the tendency of people to make mistakes in interpreting their own DNA. However, this capability of error also belongs to scientists and criminologists as well. Although the opposition argues in favor of scientific research and the trust in humanity, the truth is that it is simply unavoidable, despite the best intentions of some, for a worst-case scenario to happen involving the leakage and subsequent usage of the population's genetic material against them. The lack of understanding in the public consciousness is concerning, especially as the popularity of websites and companies that offer to analyze one's DNA grows. If there was a common rule that companies had to follow, a common human right that needed to be respected, people could truly be protected. It will help mankind advance one step further towards a world where all men are truly equal. Thank you for your time.
This was the debate for the individual right to own your DNA. Thank you for watching.